The air was thick with anticipation as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quaint, aging church. Nestled in a small town that had long been overshadowed by more modern cities, this church stood as a relic of a past that most had long since forgotten. Its architecture, a fusion of Gothic and Baroque elements, had witnessed centuries of events, some known, many lost to the tides of time. The structure, with its towering spires and weathered stone walls, appeared harmless enough from a distance, almost picturesque even. Yet beneath its sacred ground, a secret lay buried for centuries, waiting to be unearthed. The moment the excavation team arrived, they were told nothing beyond the fact that their task was a simple one: restore a part of the church's deteriorating foundation. Routine, or so it seemed. But they were wrong to assume it would be any ordinary restoration project. As the heavy machinery hummed to life, dust and dirt began to churn under the pressure, and soon something much darker began to surface. No one had expected what came next. The earth beneath the church, untouched for hundreds of years, began to give up its secrets in the form of old brittle wood and fragments of stone. The workers, intrigued by the unusual discovery, continued digging. They had stumbled upon what appeared to be a sealed crypt. At first, it was nothing more than a small break in the earth, but as the days wore on, the scale of what was uncovered became more apparent. The crypt, encased in stone and sealed shut with an ancient, rusted iron lock, hadn't seen daylight in centuries. The workers called in experts, unsure of what they were looking at. Something didn't feel right, but they couldn't place it. Historians, archaeologists, and church officials all gathered at the site. The crypt was undeniably old, much older than the church itself, which was already centuries old. Its placement beneath the church seemed deliberate, as if it had been designed to remain hidden. There was something intentional about it, as though whoever had built it didn't want anyone to find what lay inside. As the seal was carefully broken, the anticipation in the air thickened. The workers took a step back, giving the experts space to proceed. When the first of the heavy stone doors creaked open, a mixture of dust, cobwebs, and the scent of aged earth filled the air. A wave of unease swept through the crowd, as if the crypt had been waiting for them to uncover its contents. Inside, the crypt was dark, its narrow space lit only by the dim glow of flashlights. And then they saw it. Among the crumbling remnants of stone, decayed wood, and bones, lay an assortment of strange artifacts, items that didn't belong to any known period. They were not relics of the church's usual history, but something far more disturbing. Intricate carvings adorned the walls, many of which appeared to depict scenes of rituals, symbols that were both familiar and alien to the experts. At the heart of the crypt, placed carefully on an altar of sorts, was a peculiar chest, crafted from dark ancient wood. It was sealed shut with heavy chains, and the intricate carvings on its surface suggested it had been meant to protect whatever lay within. As the lid of the chest was pried open, the true horror of the discovery began to unfold. Inside, wrapped in tattered cloth, were several objects, each one more bizarre and unsettling than the last. A skull, unmistakably human, was among the first items to be uncovered, its hollow eye socket staring back at the excavators as if it had been waiting for them. Nearby, strange symbols were carved into the bone, symbols that experts could not immediately identify. The artifacts in the chest told a story of something far more ancient, more sinister, than any of the town's inhabitants could have imagined. Some of the objects were pieces of jewelry, intricate and beautifully crafted, but their designs were unfamiliar. Others were small, stone tablets covered in inscriptions that looked like a language none of the experts could read. It was clear that whoever had placed these items in the crypt had done so with a purpose that had nothing to do with the church's supposed mission of faith. As the discovery made its way to the public, the town was shaken to its core. No one had expected anything of this magnitude. The church, once a symbol of piety and devotion, had become the focal point of a mystery that threatened to rewrite the history of the town. People began to recall old stories, whispered for years but never spoken of openly. There were tales of strange occurrences, of people who had vanished without a trace, of rituals conducted in the dead of night. Locals spoke of the church's eerie aura, of the unnatural quiet that surrounded it at times, even though it had always been a place of peace. Historians pored over the church's records, but found little to explain what had been found beneath it. Most of the church's history was vague, shrouded in mystery, with gaps where crucial events had been wiped away. But the further they dug into the past, the more unsettling their findings became. The crypt, they learned, had been built centuries before the church itself, though no records explained why it had been placed directly beneath it. Some experts suggested that the church had been constructed to hide the crypt, that it had been designed to conceal something, something dangerous. As the excavation continued, the crypt revealed more of its secrets. Beneath the altar, a series of carved symbols was found, symbols that seemed to tell a story of a long-forgotten ritual. The details were fragmented, but there was enough to suggest that the people who had buried these items had been involved in something far darker than mere superstition. The crypt had not been built to house holy relics, but to hide something much more ancient, something that had been deemed too dangerous to remain in the world above. The church, it seemed, had been built as a facade. Behind its holy mission, it had concealed something far darker, a secret so powerful that it had been hidden away for generations. The real purpose of the church, it appeared, was not just to serve the community, but to safeguard something that no one was meant to uncover. But the moment the crypt was disturbed, the secret had been exposed. As the team of experts sifted through the artifacts, they uncovered evidence of a ritual that had taken place beneath the church. It was clear that whoever had conducted this ritual had done so with the intention of keeping something imprisoned, something dangerous that needed to be buried and forgotten. The question remained, what had been buried beneath the church and why had it been so important to keep it hidden for so long? The answer to that question was just out of reach, but the discovery beneath the church had already begun to change everything. What was once thought to be a quiet, peaceful town, had now become the center of a mystery that would shake the very foundation of history itself. The search for answers had only just begun, and with each new clue uncovered, the story became more unsettling, more chilling. As the team prepared to delve deeper into the mystery, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the church might be hiding, and whether the truth would ever be allowed to surface. The town had always been quiet, its life steeped in the slow rhythms of rural existence. For centuries, it had remained largely untouched by the rush of modernity that had swept through larger cities. The church, with its looming spires and ancient stone walls, had always been the center of life here. Generations had come and gone, and yet the church remained, a symbol of tradition and faith, its very presence a quiet reassurance to the townspeople. But beneath the surface of this peaceful facade, there had always been an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't something you could put into words, just a sense that the church, with all its beauty and grandeur, had been hiding something that wasn't meant to be discovered. The locals had their suspicions, of course. Rumors had been passed down for generations, whispered in hushed tones, always veiled in superstition. There were those who claimed that the church was built on sacred ground, that the land had been cursed long before the first stone of the church had been laid. Others spoke of strange occurrences, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and odd happenings that had plagued the town for centuries. But for the most part, these stories had been dismissed as folklore, relics of a bygone era. People tended to ignore the unsettling tales, chalking them up to the inevitable embellishments of those who had too much time to let their imaginations run wild. After all, the church was still there, still standing, and that in itself was a testament to its power. It had endured through wars, plagues, and the changing tides of history. What could possibly be hidden beneath it that could challenge its reputation? But that was before the excavation. When the restoration project had begun, no one could have predicted the chain of events that would follow. The team of workers, brought in to shore up the foundation and repair some of the more visible damage, had no idea what they were walking into. Their task was simple, or so they thought. But as they began to dig deeper, something began to stir beneath the earth, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. At first, it was just a crack in the ground, barely noticeable amidst the rubble. But as the workers continued their digging, the crack widened, revealing something far more significant. They uncovered a passage, narrow, winding, and deep. It was as though the earth itself had been concealing a hidden space, one that had been sealed away from the world for reasons unknown. As the workers ventured deeper, they began to uncover the remains of what appeared to be an ancient crypt, its stone walls still standing strong despite the centuries that had passed. The moment the crypt was uncovered, the air seemed to change. The very ground beneath their feet felt different, heavier, as though the earth was holding its breath. The workers had no idea what they were about to uncover, but they instinctively felt that something was wrong. The crypt, they quickly realized, wasn't just an ordinary burial chamber. It was something more, something that had been designed to remain hidden. Its entrance was sealed with a rusted iron lock, old but still intact. The workers attempted to open it, but it wouldn't budge. They tried again and again, their efforts only adding to the growing sense of unease that hung in the air. It wasn't until the experts arrived that the true scope of what had been uncovered began to sink in. The church officials, along with a team of historians, archaeologists, and local researchers, gathered at the site, unsure of what they were dealing with. The crypt, they discovered, was not just old, it was ancient, far older than the church itself. Its origins could not be traced, and its purpose remained a mystery. Why had it been built beneath the church? What had it been meant to conceal? As the excavation continued, the true extent of the crypt's significance began to unfold. Inside, they found the remnants of a long-forgotten past. The walls were adorned with carvings and symbols, many of which were unfamiliar to the experts. These were not the usual religious symbols one would expect to find in a church crypt. Instead, they were strange, cryptic marks, symbols that spoke of a different belief system, one that seemed to blend the sacred with the occult. The deeper the team dug, the more they uncovered. It became clear that this was no ordinary burial chamber. This was a place that had been designed to hide something, a secret far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And then there were the artifacts. They began to emerge one by one, each more disturbing than the last. A small, intricately carved box, its surface covered in strange markings. A series of stone tablets, each inscribed with symbols that no one could immediately recognize. And, perhaps most chilling of all, a human skull, its hollow eyes staring out from the darkness. The skull had been placed carefully on an altar, surrounded by other strange items, stones, candles, and fragments of what appeared to be old, torn fabric. The arrangement was deliberate, as though whoever had placed these objects there had been performing some sort of ritual. But the meaning behind it was unclear. The discovery of the crypt was just the beginning. As more was unearthed, the mystery deepened. The further they dug, the more bizarre and unsettling the artifacts became. Small objects that seemed out of place, pieces of jewelry, a tarnished ring, a broken pendant, each one more bizarre than the last. And among these items, a series of books, their pages yellowed with age. Some were written in languages that no one could decipher, while others seemed to contain strange illustrations, drawings that depicted rituals and ceremonies that seemed to defy logic. As the artifacts were catalogued and examined, experts began to speculate about the true purpose of the crypt. Some believed it had been a burial site, a resting place for someone of great importance. But others, more cautious in their assessment, began to question whether this had been a place of worship, or something far darker. The symbols and artifacts suggested a connection to occult practices, to rituals that had been deliberately hidden from the world. The crypt had not been built to honor the dead, but to conceal something far more dangerous. With each new discovery, the mystery surrounding the church grew. What had been buried beneath the ground? Why had it been sealed away for so long? And what had the church known about this hidden past? The more they uncovered, the more questions arose, each one leading them deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and lies. The church, it seemed, had been hiding something all along, a secret so powerful, so dangerous, that it had been deemed too dangerous for the world to know. The excavation team, now deeply entrenched in their work, began to grow uneasy. What had started as a simple restoration project had quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. The church's history, once thought to be simple and unremarkable, was now being called into question. What had the church been trying to conceal? And why had it been so important to keep these secrets hidden? The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. And with each new revelation, the mystery grew darker, more complex. The church had not been built as a sanctuary, but as a hiding place, concealing a past that had been buried for reasons that were still unclear. The crypt, with its strange symbols and eerie artifacts, was just the tip of the iceberg. What lay beneath it, still buried deep within the earth, was a truth that no one had been prepared to face. And yet, as the excavation continued, there was a growing sense of dread among the team. They had uncovered something far more significant than they could have ever imagined. Something that would change everything. What had been hidden for so long was now beginning to surface, and the truth, it seemed, was more terrifying than anyone had ever thought possible. The church, once a symbol of faith, had become a place of fear, a monument to a dark past that refused to stay buried. And as the team of experts and workers stood at the edge of the crypt, staring into the darkness below, they knew one thing for certain. They were not just uncovering history. They were uncovering a nightmare. As the excavation team delved deeper into the crypt, a palpable tension gripped the site. The initial excitement that had accompanied the discovery began to give way to an overwhelming sense of dread. What had started as a routine restoration project had now spiraled into something much more sinister. The air around the church seemed heavier, almost suffocating, as though the very earth itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. The crypt had been sealed for centuries, and whatever had been hidden within it was not meant to see the light of day again. The team could feel it, an unspoken warning, an invisible force pushing back against their intrusion. With every passing day, the crypt revealed more of its dark past. The objects unearthed were unlike anything the experts had ever seen before, unfamiliar artifacts, each one more chilling than the last. As the workers carefully removed layers of dust and debris, they uncovered strange, otherworldly relics that seemed to defy explanation. There was something about the items that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. These were not simply relics of a forgotten time, but remnants of something far older, something that had been deliberately hidden away. One of the first items to be uncovered was a small, intricately carved box. Its surface was covered in elaborate symbols, some of which resembled the strange markings found on the walls of the crypt. The box was heavy, its wood dark and aged, and it seemed to hum with an eerie energy. When it was opened, the contents inside sent a shiver down the spines of those present. There were no precious gems or gold coins, no artifacts of historical value. Instead, inside the box lay a single, perfectly preserved object. A small, bone-like figure, its features worn smooth by time. It was unmistakably human in shape, but its proportions were wrong, distorted in a way that made it seem almost grotesque. The figure's empty, hollow eyes stared back at the onlookers, as though it had been waiting for them to find it. This discovery set the tone for what was to come. Each new object uncovered from the crypt seemed to carry with it a sense of unease, as though it had been placed there with a deliberate purpose, one that had nothing to do with the church's religious function. As the team continued their excavation, they found more and more pieces of evidence pointing toward an entirely different narrative, one that had been hidden beneath the church for centuries. It became clear that the crypt had not been built to honor the dead, but to conceal something far more terrifying. Among the most unsettling of the finds was a series of stone tablets, each covered in strange, indecipherable inscriptions. The tablets were large and heavy, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of neglect. The symbols etched into them were unlike any known language, a jumble of shapes and figures that seemed to defy logical interpretation. Some of the experts speculated that the tablets were connected to ancient occult practices, possibly tied to the secretive rituals that the church's founders had been rumored to have conducted. Others believed that the symbols represented a lost civilization, one that had been wiped from the pages of history. Regardless of their origin, the tablets were a stark reminder that the church was hiding more than just the bones of the dead. It was hiding a dark and twisted past, one that no one had been meant to uncover. As the artifacts piled up, so too did the questions. What was the significance of the strange symbols? Why had they been concealed beneath the church, buried away from the world? And perhaps most chilling of all, what had the church's founders known about the crypt and its contents? The deeper the team dug, the more they uncovered, but with each new revelation came even more uncertainty. The crypt seemed to hold no answers, only more questions, each one leading them further down a path that they were not prepared to walk. The discovery of the crypt had already begun to shake the town to its core. What had once been considered nothing more than folklore, the mysterious disappearances, the strange happenings surrounding the church, was now being given weight. The church, a place that had been revered for centuries, was now at the center of a mystery that threatened to change everything. But for the townspeople, this was more than just a historical discovery, it was personal. Families had lived in the town for generations, and many had ties to the church that ran deep. What would this new revelation mean for them? And what was the true legacy of the church that had been built on their land? The more the team uncovered, the more it became apparent that the church's history had been carefully crafted, shaped over the years to hide the truth. The walls of the crypt had been lined with symbols of power, symbols that spoke not of faith but of control. There were hints of ancient, forbidden rituals that had been performed in secret, far from the watchful eyes of the public. It was as though the founders of the church had known something that they had been determined to protect at any cost. The crypt had been sealed for a reason, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the truth contained within it was not meant to be uncovered. As the days passed, the excavation team began to uncover more disturbing evidence. A set of human remains was found in the far corner of the crypt, their bones carefully arranged in a ritualistic pattern. The body appeared to be that of a man, though much of the flesh had long since decayed. What remained was a skeleton, its bones oddly positioned, as if they had been placed deliberately in a certain formation. Surrounding the remains were more of the strange symbols found on the tablets, as well as a series of objects, items that seemed to have no place in a typical burial site. There were fragments of candles, remnants of incense, and pieces of torn fabric that appeared to be part of a ritualistic costume. The experts were baffled. What had happened here? What had the person buried in the crypt been involved in? And why had they been buried in such a peculiar manner? The arrangement of the body suggested that it had been part of a larger, more complex ritual, one that had been conducted with a specific purpose in mind. The question now was, what had that purpose been? As the crypt slowly gave up its secrets, the sense of dread grew stronger. It was as if the very air around the excavation site was charged with an electric tension, as though something was watching, waiting. The deeper the team dug, the more they felt as though they were being drawn into something far beyond their understanding. What had the church been hiding beneath its foundations? And why had it been so important to keep these secrets buried for so long? In the quiet of the night, when the excavation crew was packing up to leave, some of the workers reported strange sounds emanating from the crypt, whispers, faint and indecipherable. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the darkness, figures that seemed to flicker and vanish before they could be properly seen. These accounts, at first dismissed as the result of overactive imaginations, began to spread among the crew. The sense of unease grew, and soon, it was clear that the crypt had become more than just an archaeological site. It had become a place of danger, a place that seemed to resist their attempts to uncover its secrets. As the workers continued to uncover the crypt's mysteries, they were left with more questions than answers. The more they learned, the more they realized just how little they truly understood. What lay beneath the church was not just a relic of the past, it was a warning. A warning that something far older and more powerful had been buried there, hidden away from the world. And now that it was being unearthed, the town could never be the same again. The crypt was not just a place of burial, it was a place of confinement. And whatever had been locked away beneath the church was now stirring, awakening from its long slumber. What had been hidden for centuries was now being exposed, and with it came a terrifying question. What would happen when the secrets of the crypt were finally revealed? As the excavation work progressed, the town's atmosphere grew heavier, laden with an unease that hung in the air like an unspoken promise. The news of the crypt's discovery spread like wildfire, and with it came the inevitable questions that demanded answers. While the historians, archaeologists, and experts worked tirelessly to uncover the truth buried beneath the church, the townspeople, many of whom had lived their entire lives in the shadow of the church, began to reflect on their own histories and the strange stories that had been passed down through generations. Local folklore was rife with tales of mysterious disappearances, inexplicable deaths, and odd occurrences that seemed to coincide with the church's long history. Most of these stories had been dismissed as nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations or exaggerations, but now, with the crypt unearthed and its disturbing contents slowly coming to light, those stories began to take on a new, more ominous meaning. What if there had been some truth to them after all? The church had always been a central figure in the life of the town. It had stood there for centuries, a symbol of faith, community, and stability. But for some, it had also been a source of fear. Older residents whispered of times when the church's doors had been locked for weeks on end, when no one had seen the priest, and when strange sounds had emanated from within its walls. There were tales of figures moving about in the dark, their faces hidden in the shadows, of strange rituals held in the dead of night, and of the unsettling feeling that something was watching from behind the stained glass windows. These were the stories of the elders, stories that had become part of the town's collective memory but were never spoken of openly, for fear of unsettling the delicate peace that had existed for so long. But now, as the crypt was slowly being unearthed, those stories took on a new light. The crypt's contents suggested that the church's history was far darker than anyone had imagined. The relics, the strange carvings, the human remains, all spoke of a past steeped in secrecy, of hidden rituals that had been performed long before the church had been built. There were signs of an ancient cult, of a belief system that had little to do with the Christian faith that the church espoused. What had happened in the years before the church was constructed? And what had been the true purpose of the crypt? Among the first to make a connection between the crypt and the strange stories of the past was a local historian named Evelyn Marlowe. A resident of the town for most of her life, Evelyn had always been intrigued by the church's mysterious history. She had spent years poring over old records, letters, and journals, trying to piece together the story of the church and its founders. But much of what she uncovered was either vague or deliberately erased from the historical record. It was as though someone had been trying to hide the truth, to erase the church's origins from memory. Evelyn had always suspected that the church was hiding something important. But she had never imagined that it would be something so dark. As she began to study the artifacts found in the crypt, Evelyn realized that many of them were connected to a cult-like belief system that had existed in the area long before the church's construction. The symbols on the stone tablets, the strange rituals depicted in the carvings, even the human remains, all pointed to something much older than the town itself. It became clear that the church had not been built as a place of worship, but as a cover for something far more sinister. But what had the church's founders known about the cult? And why had they gone to such lengths to conceal its existence? Evelyn's research took her down a rabbit hole of ancient history, revealing connections between the church's founders and a secretive group known as the Order of the Veil. This obscure and little-known organization had been active in the region centuries ago, practicing rituals that were said to invoke dark powers. According to some of the ancient texts she uncovered, the Order of the Veil had believed in the existence of an ancient force, an entity that lived beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened. The church, it seemed, had been built on top of this force, its crypt serving as a prison, a containment vessel to keep the entity from breaking free. But the more Evelyn dug, the more she began to understand that the church's founders had not just been protecting the town from this force, they had been using it. The rituals, the ceremonies, the crypt itself, it was all part of a larger plan to harness the power of the entity, to control it and use it for their own purposes. The church had been built as a facade, a place of worship on the surface, while below it, hidden in the darkness, the Order of the Veil had conducted their forbidden rites. The crypt was not a tomb, but a prison, and the entity it contained had been sealed away for a reason. As Evelyn's research continued, she discovered more disturbing truths. The crypt's contents were not the work of a single cult or religious group. They were the remnants of several different belief systems, all of which had converged on the church in the centuries before its construction. The crypt had been used by various groups, some seeking to control the entity beneath the earth, others hoping to appease it, and still others trying to keep it contained. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the church had been built as a place of power, a place where dark forces had been manipulated for centuries. But the true horror of Evelyn's discovery lay in the realization that the entity beneath the church was not just a myth or a superstition. It was real. The artifacts found in the crypt, the symbols, the remains, everything pointed to the existence of a force far older and more powerful than anything the town had ever known. And now, with the crypt disturbed and its secrets exposed, that force was beginning to stir once more. The excavation team, too, began to feel the effects of their actions. As they uncovered more of the crypt's hidden chambers, strange things began to happen. Workers reported hearing whispers in the dark, faint voices that seemed to come from nowhere, calling them by name. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving in the corners of their vision, figures that flickered in and out of existence. Others spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that gripped them as they ventured deeper into the crypt, a feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that they were not just dealing with ancient artifacts. They were dealing with something alive, something that had been waiting for centuries to be discovered. And now that it was awakening, it was no longer content to remain hidden beneath the earth. The town itself began to change. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Animals behaving erratically, people experiencing unexplainable nightmares, and a pervasive feeling of unease that settled over the streets like a dark cloud. The church, once a place of sanctuary, had become a place of fear, its presence now more ominous than ever before. It was as if the very foundations of the town were being shaken, as though the crypt's disturbance was reverberating through time, unlocking something that had been sealed away for a reason. As Evelyn continued to dig into the church's dark history, she found herself at a crossroads. The town had no idea what it was dealing with, no idea of the danger that lay beneath their feet. And the more she uncovered, the more she feared that the crypt's secrets were not just part of the past. They were part of the present and perhaps even the future. Whatever had been hidden there for centuries was no longer content to remain buried. The crypt had once been a prison, but now it was a doorway, a gateway to something far more terrifying. And Evelyn realized with growing horror that the church's founders had known exactly what they were doing. They hadn't just built the church to protect the town from dark forces. They had built it to control them, to keep them locked away for their own gain. But now that the crypt had been disturbed, the forces contained within were awakening, and the town was no longer safe. Neither was Evelyn. She now had a decision to make: continue uncovering the truth, knowing that every piece of information she gathered might bring her closer to the entity beneath the church, or walk away and leave the town to face whatever had been unleashed. But there was one thing she knew for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The past had been buried, but it was coming back, and the future was about to be rewritten in the most horrifying way imaginable. The atmosphere around the church had become suffocating, thick with a tension that no one could quite explain. The townspeople had always whispered about strange happenings, about the unsettling nature of the place, but no one had ever imagined that their suspicions would one day prove to be true. Now that the crypt had been uncovered, with its strange artifacts and ominous symbols, the church was no longer just a historical monument. It had transformed into something far more dangerous, a dark presence that loomed over the town like a shadow that refused to fade. As the excavation team dug deeper into the crypt, they uncovered more and more disturbing findings. The crypt's walls, which had once seemed like the simple foundation of a burial site, now appeared to be part of a much larger, more intricate structure. An ancient place of power built not just for the dead, but to contain something far more malevolent. The walls were etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive, as if they had been waiting for this moment, for the moment when the church's secret would finally be revealed. The deeper the team went, the more it seemed as though they were crossing some sort of threshold, a point of no return. Each artifact they uncovered seemed to bring with it a new layer of horror, a new understanding of the church's true purpose. There were strange, unnerving markings on the walls that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, as though they were not static but dynamic, changing in real time. Some experts claimed that these markings were the work of ancient civilizations, their significance lost to history. Others, more cautious, speculated that the markings were part of a ritualistic design, something that had been created to keep something contained, something that was not meant to be free. And then there were the bones, human remains, buried in strange positions, arranged as if they had been part of a ritual. The bodies were not those of ordinary people. The experts quickly realized that these were not just burial remains, they were the remnants of sacrifices. The bones had been carefully placed in the crypt, positioned with intention as though each one was part of a larger, more complex ritual. It was clear that the crypt was not a place of rest, but a site for dark, forbidden practices, and the very air around it seemed to hum with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. As the team sifted through the remains, they discovered items that were beyond explanation. Small, intricately carved figurines made of bone, depicting distorted human figures that seemed to writhe in agony. Fragments of what appeared to be ceremonial clothing, stained with age and wear, but still recognizable as part of some sort of ritualistic costume. Strange amulets, each carved with symbols that none of the experts could decipher. Each item uncovered seemed to add weight to the growing realization that this crypt was not just an ancient burial site, it was a prison, a containment chamber for something far more powerful and terrifying. The connection between the crypt and the church's founders began to take shape as the team worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. The church, they now realized, had been constructed not as a sanctuary of faith, but as a barrier, a means to keep something contained. The strange rituals, the sacrifices, the crypt itself, all of it was part of a larger plan, one that had been set in motion long before the church had been built. The church had not been a place of salvation but a place of containment, a prison designed to hold something that was too dangerous to be allowed free in the world. As the days went by, the discovery of the crypt began to consume everyone involved. What had once been a simple excavation project had become something much more dangerous, and it was clear that the town's history was far darker than anyone had imagined. The crypt was a key to a long-forgotten past, a past that had been deliberately erased from the town's official records. The more the team uncovered, the more it became clear that the church's founders had been part of a secretive group, a cult-like organization that had sought to harness the power of whatever lay beneath the earth. Evelyn Marlowe, the local historian, had been at the forefront of the investigation. Her research had led her to the discovery of the Order of the Veil, a secretive and ancient group that had existed centuries ago. The order, she found, had been obsessed with the idea of controlling dark, primal forces, forces that had been buried beneath the earth for millennia. The church, it seemed, had been built to house these forces, to keep them locked away from the world. The crypt was not just a tomb, it was a prison for an entity that the founders had believed would grant them unimaginable power. As Evelyn delved deeper into the history of the Order of the Veil, she uncovered more unsettling truths. The order had not been content with merely containing the entity, they had been trying to harness its power, to use it for their own gain. The rituals, the sacrifices, the strange artifacts, they were all part of an effort to tap into this ancient force, to control it and bend it to their will. And from what Evelyn could piece together, it seemed that the church's founders had been successful, at least for a time. The entity had been sealed away, contained within the crypt, where it could do no harm. But now, as the excavation continued, it seemed that the entity was stirring once again. The crypt had been disturbed, and with it, the delicate balance that had kept the entity contained for so long. The more the team uncovered, the more they felt the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that was no longer content to remain hidden in the darkness. The crypt was not just a place of death, it was a place of power, a power that was now awakening. The excavation team began to experience strange phenomena as they worked. Workers reported hearing whispers in the dark, faint voices that seemed to call to them from within the depths of the crypt. Some claimed to see shadowy figures moving in the corners of their vision, figures that flickered and vanished before they could be fully seen. Others spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. The deeper they dug, the stronger the sense of unease grew. It was as though the very air around the crypt was charged with a malevolent energy, a force that was beginning to awaken from its long slumber. Evelyn, too, began to feel the effects of the crypt's awakening. She had spent hours poring over ancient texts, deciphering cryptic inscriptions, and piecing together the history of the Order of the Veil, but she could feel something changing. It was as if the crypt itself was calling to her, urging her to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that the truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The crypt had not just been a place of power, it was a gateway, a doorway to something far older and more terrifying than anyone had anticipated. The entity that had been sealed away for centuries was not a simple demon or spirit, it was something much older, much more primal. It was a force that had existed long before human civilization, a force that had been buried beneath the earth to keep it from consuming the world. And now, as the crypt was disturbed, that force was beginning to stir, to wake from its long slumber. The rituals, the sacrifices, the strange symbols, it was all part of a plan to keep the entity contained, to prevent it from breaking free. But that plan had been interrupted, and now the entity was no longer willing to stay buried. As the days passed, the town grew more restless. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Animals acting erratically, people experiencing disturbing nightmares, a pervasive sense of unease settling over the streets. The church, once a symbol of peace and sanctity, had become a source of fear. The townspeople could feel it. Something was wrong, something was awakening, and they were powerless to stop it. Evelyn knew that the truth was now out in the open, and there was no going back. The church had been built to contain the entity, but now that it had been disturbed, there was no telling what might happen. The crypt was no longer just a historical site, it was a battleground between ancient forces, and the town was caught in the middle. Evelyn understood that the only way to stop the entity from breaking free was to find a way to reseal the crypt, to undo the damage that had been done. But she wasn't sure if it was even possible. The entity had been buried for so long, and now that it was awake, there was no telling how much power it had gained over the centuries. The town was on the brink of something terrible, and Evelyn was the only one who truly understood the gravity of what had been unleashed. The question now was whether she could stop it before it was too late, or if the dark forces contained beneath the church would consume everything in their path. The future of the town, and perhaps the world, now rested in her hands. The situation in the town had escalated quickly, morphing from a quiet historical curiosity into a full-blown crisis. What had once been an excavation of historical interest had now become a battle between the unknown and those brave enough to uncover the truth. The crypt, once an eerie and mysterious structure, was now a ticking time bomb, its secrets about to explode out into the open. Evelyn Marlowe, the town's historian, felt a deep sense of urgency she couldn't shake. The crypt, the strange artifacts, the disturbing symbols, it was all coming together in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. And yet, she knew one thing with growing certainty. Whatever had been sealed beneath the church had to stay sealed. The question now was whether that was still even possible. In the days following the most recent discoveries, the town seemed to be descending into chaos. People began reporting strange occurrences, sounds coming from the church at night, loud banging and scraping noises as though something was moving beneath the earth. Others felt a strange pressure in the air, as though the atmosphere itself was thickening, suffocating them. The eerie feeling that had once been confined to the church grounds was now spreading across the town. Even the once ordinary, quiet streets felt different, darker, as if the town itself had become an unwilling participant in this dark awakening. Evelyn knew that the crypt's disturbance was not a coincidence. The entity that had been sealed away for centuries, trapped beneath the church, was stirring, and as it did, it seemed to be reaching out, expanding its influence beyond the confines of the crypt. She had spent days poring over ancient texts and obscure historical records, trying to make sense of the force that had been contained for so long, but the more she learned, the more terrifying the situation became. The Order of the Veil, the group responsible for the crypt's creation, had believed they were harnessing the entity's power, bending it to their will. But it was clear now that they had been mistaken. The entity was not something to be controlled, it was something to be feared. And now it was no longer contained. With each passing day, the air in the town grew heavier, as though the very fabric of reality was being twisted by the power below. Evelyn began to experience strange dreams, dreams in which she wandered the church, lost in its darkened halls. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy. In these dreams she could hear whispers, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from every direction. The voices called to her, urging her to uncover more, to understand more. But the more she heard, the more terrified she became. The entity wanted her to release it, wanted her to be the key to its freedom. It was as if it had been waiting for her all along, as though it knew she would be the one to uncover its secrets. In one of these dreams, Evelyn stood in front of the crypt, the entrance wide open. Inside, the shadows seemed to writhe and twist as though they were alive. At the center of the chamber was a stone altar, and on it lay something alive. She could see its shape through the fog, its form both human and inhuman, a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and darkness. It was pulsating, its heartbeat loud and erratic, and as she stepped closer, she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. She reached out, her hand trembling as it neared the altar. And then, just as her fingers were about to touch the altar, she woke up. The dreams continued, night after night, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. Evelyn knew that these were not just dreams, they were warnings. The entity was reaching out to her, trying to make her its vessel, its key to freedom. She understood now that the crypt had not been a simple burial site. It had been built to house this force, this ancient being which had been sealed away for a reason. The Order of the Veil had known what they were dealing with, but they had underestimated the entity's power. And now, that power was waking, and the church was the only thing standing between it and the rest of the world. Evelyn's research began to focus solely on the crypt, on understanding the entity and how it had been kept contained for so long. She discovered that the crypt was not just a burial site but a prison. The stone walls, the strange symbols, and the human remains, they were all part of a complex ritual designed to keep the entity bound. The altar in the center of the crypt was the key, the focal point of the ritual that had sealed the entity away. But the ritual was not flawless. It relied on the church itself, on the foundation of the building, to maintain its integrity. And now that the crypt had been disturbed, the ritual was weakening. The entity was waking, and there was no telling what it would do once it broke free. The more Evelyn uncovered, the more she realized that the town's fate was hanging by a thread. The church, once a symbol of faith, had become a tomb, a prison for something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The crypt was not a relic of the past. It was a living, breathing entity, one that had been contained for centuries, and it was now beginning to stretch its limbs, testing the boundaries that had kept it locked away. The church itself was starting to show signs of strain. The foundation was shifting, the stone walls groaning under the pressure of something unseen. It was as if the church was alive, its very structure resonating with the entity beneath it. Evelyn couldn't help but feel that time was running out. The longer the excavation continued, the more the town seemed to slip into chaos. People began to disappear. At first it was just one or two, then more. The police were baffled, unable to explain the sudden vanishing of townspeople. There were no signs of struggle, no clues, no trace left behind. It was as though they had simply vanished into thin air. Rumors spread quickly, with some claiming that the crypt was cursed, others whispering that the entity was taking its toll on the town. But no one knew for sure what was happening, only that things were spiraling out of control. The people of the town began to gather, talking in hushed voices about what might be happening. They spoke of the church, of the crypt, of the strange happenings that seemed to be multiplying. And as they spoke, a sense of fear began to take root in the community. The once peaceful town was now a place of suspicion and paranoia, as people began to look at one another with fearful eyes. The church had always been a place of solace, a place of community, but now it was a symbol of something darker, something far more insidious. Evelyn knew that the time for research and study was over. She had to act. But what could she do? The crypt had been disturbed, the entity was waking, and the only thing standing between it and the world was a weakening barrier. She knew that the only way to stop the entity from breaking free was to reseal the crypt. But how? The ritual had been broken, the balance had been disturbed, and she wasn't even sure if it was possible to put things back the way they were. The crypt had been constructed with an ancient understanding of dark magic, a power that had long been lost to time. Could she, one single person, hope to undo the damage that had been done? With a sense of dread settling in her chest, Evelyn began to make preparations. She would have to enter the crypt herself. There was no one else who could do it. No one else had the knowledge, the understanding of what had happened. She had to try. But as she prepared to descend into the heart of the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. She had read the old texts, understood the rituals, but there was so much she didn't know. And with the town on the brink of destruction, there was no time left to learn. The crypt was waiting, its secrets ready to be uncovered, and Evelyn was about to become its final key. Would she be able to stop the entity before it was too late? Or would the ancient force beneath the church break free, consuming everything in its path? There was no way of knowing, only the eerie certainty that the clock was ticking, and Evelyn was running out of time. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. Evelyn knew that if she didn't act, the entire town, perhaps even the world, would be at the mercy of whatever had been sealed beneath the church for centuries. Every bone in her body screamed at her to stop, to turn away, but the weight of what she had uncovered, the relentless pull of the crypt, was far too strong to ignore. It was as though the crypt itself was calling to her, urging her to come closer, to finish what had been started long ago. The chilling whispers from her dreams had only grown louder, more insistent, and she knew deep down that this wasn't just a matter of historical curiosity, it was a battle for the future. Evelyn stood in front of the church, its looming silhouette dark against the cloudy sky. The sense of foreboding that hung over the building was overwhelming. The town, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed to be sinking into an abyss, its people plagued by nightmares, disappearances, and a palpable sense of dread. The church, once a beacon of hope, had become a symbol of fear, its walls hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. She had spent countless hours researching, poring over ancient texts, and trying to piece together the puzzle of the crypt and the entity that lay beneath it. She knew the danger of what she was about to do. The crypt wasn't just a prison for some ancient, malevolent force. It was a delicate containment chamber. The rituals, the symbols, the very structure of the crypt itself, all worked in concert to keep the entity trapped within the earth. And now, as the crypt had been disturbed, the balance had shifted. The entity, once dormant, was awake and stirring, reaching out with tendrils of dark power that were already beginning to warp the fabric of reality in the town. Evelyn's mind raced as she stood at the entrance to the church. She could feel the air around her thickening, pressing down on her chest, as though the very atmosphere had become charged with a dark energy. The church, she realized, had not just been built on sacred ground, it had been built on a powerful ancient nexus, a point where the veil between the world of the living and something far darker was at its thinnest. This wasn't a simple religious site, it was a focal point, a conduit through which dark forces had been able to influence the town for centuries. The whispers from her dreams returned, this time clearer than ever, as though the entity was speaking directly to her, urging her forward. She felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as the air grew heavier with each passing moment. Her every instinct told her to run, to leave the church behind and never look back. But Evelyn knew that this was no longer just about her own safety. The lives of everyone in the town were at risk, and she was the only one who could stop it. She took a deep breath and stepped inside the church. The once holy sanctuary now felt like a tomb, a place where the light struggled to reach, swallowed by the dark energy that emanated from the crypt below. The smell of damp stone and age-old incense filled her nostrils as she made her way to the altar. The church was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though something was watching her every move. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space, the sound somehow muffled by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. The altar, where the rituals had once been performed, loomed ahead of her. It was here that the Order of the Veil had conducted their dark ceremonies, where they had tried to harness the power of the entity beneath the earth. The altar had been a key part of the ritual to keep the entity bound, but it was now just a relic of a time long past, a reminder of the price that had been paid to imprison something so powerful. Evelyn approached the altar with a sense of dread weighing on her heart. The stone was cold beneath her fingertips as she placed her hand on it. The surface felt rough, as though the stone itself had absorbed centuries of dark energy, and Evelyn could almost feel the pulse of the entity beneath the ground, the faint tremor that seemed to radiate from the very earth. She closed her eyes, listening to the whispers that were now louder than ever before. The voice, low and guttural, seemed to seep into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a dark fog. "Release me." It was a single word, but it carried with it the weight of centuries, the promise of untold power. Evelyn's heart raced in her chest, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the sheer intensity of the sensation. The entity wanted to break free, and it was willing to do anything to make that happen. But Evelyn knew she couldn't let that happen. She had seen what the entity was capable of, what it had done to the town's history, how it had corrupted the very fabric of reality itself. She had seen the sacrifices made in its name, the lives lost to its insatiable hunger for power. She could not, would not, allow it to break free and wreak havoc on the world. She pulled herself together, forcing her mind to focus. She had one chance, one opportunity to put things right. She had to re-establish the ritual, rebind the entity to its prison, before it was too late. The crypt had been disturbed and the ritual had been broken, but that didn't mean it was lost forever. Evelyn had learned enough in her research to know that the power of the entity was not limitless. It was bound by the ritual, and if the ritual could be completed, if the right words were spoken, the entity could be contained once more. She made her way to the entrance of the crypt, her mind racing with the knowledge she had acquired in her studies. As she descended the steps into the darkness below, she felt the air grow colder, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence pressing down on her with every step. The crypt was alive, pulsing with dark energy. She could feel it in the stone beneath her feet, in the air she breathed, in the very walls around her. The crypt's layout was exactly as she had seen in her research. The altar was at the center, surrounded by strange symbols etched into the stone. The walls were covered in ancient runes, their meaning still a mystery, but their power undeniable. The remains of the bodies, carefully arranged in ritualistic patterns, were a testament to the dark practices that had taken place here. The bones seemed to stare back at her with empty eyes, silent witnesses to the horrors that had been committed in this place. At the center of the crypt lay the altar, the focal point of the ritual that had once contained the entity. Evelyn approached it carefully, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She could hear the whispers in her mind again, louder this time, urging her to stop, to abandon her mission. But she had come too far. There was no turning back. She knelt before the altar and placed her hands on the cold stone. She could feel the tremors in the earth below her, the pulse of the entity's presence, stronger now, more insistent. The ritual had to be completed. She began to chant the words she had learned, the incantations that had been used to bind the entity all those years ago. The symbols around the crypt began to glow, faint at first, but then brighter, more intense, as though the very walls were coming alive.